म्यूट को बोल रहा होते
Everything okay, Vivek?
Yes, so we're setting up our live Facebook Live.
Okay. Let me know when you're ready.
Okay, so let's begin.
Right.
Okay, so namaste, good evening, and good afternoon, everyone, from wherever you're watching us. I'm your moderator for this session. I'm Vivek Dostapa, Program Coordinator and Research Associate at NICE. Before we start, I would like to quickly introduce NICE. NICE is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank based in Nepal, which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. And I would like to welcome you all to a very special session of our Tech in IR series. The topic for today is legal responsibilities for autonomous weapons and emerging means and methods of armed conflicts. For this very special session, it is my pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Chan Wah Teck S.C. Mr. Jeffrey read law at the University of Singapore on a President's Scholarship, graduating in 1973 as the Gold Medallist of his class. He obtained his LL.M from Harvard University and completed the Advanced Management program at Wharton Business School. He held a wide range of appointments in the Singapore legal service before retiring in 2018. These included Deputy Public Prosecutor, State Counsel, Assistant Registrar at Supreme Court, Registrar of the Appeals Board in Land Acquisition, Magistrate, State Coroner, Senior State Counsel, and Director, Legal Services, Ministry of Defense. He was for many years head of the civil as well as the International Affairs Division of the Attorney General's Chambers before being designated as the Deputy Solicitor-General. And in the course of his career, he has held numerous appointments, including chairman of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law and chair of several UNCITRAL working groups, chief negotiator for a number of international treaties, and delegation leader to numerous ASEAN, Commonwealth, and other international forums. He was a member of the San Remo Roundtable of Experts that produced the San Remo Manual on International Humanitarian Law applicable to armed conflicts at sea. He was president of the Medical Legal Society of Singapore and vice president of Singapore Red Cross. He was also the president of the Rotary Club of Raffles City and was twice assistant governor of Rotary International District 3310. Mr. Chan is presently a senior director of TSMP Law Corporation Singapore and an adjunct professor at the National University of Singapore, where he teaches international humanitarian law. He is also a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators as well as the Singapore Institute of Arbitrators. Additionally, he is a senior mediator of the Singapore Mediation Center. For his work in IHL in 2024, he was conferred the Red Cross Service to Humanity Award, the highest Singapore Red Cross Award by the President of Singapore. So, sir, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence here today. And I would like to request you to make your remarks and then we will follow up with question and answers. In the meantime, whatever questions the participants may have, please drop them in the chat box below. And I would like to hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Vivek, and namaste, everyone. I understand most of you are from South India, and as you know, I'm from Singapore, and we have a very large community of persons from South India and even larger community of persons of South Indian descent. Many of my friends are persons of South Indian descent. So I'm very happy to hear this evening, and I'd like to thank NICE for this opportunity to speak to you all about a subject that is becoming increasingly interesting and complex and relevant. in today's world. So let me just get to my slides and begin my presentation. I'll first share screen and go to my slides. My slides are animated, but I don't know how to get it done. Right.
So maybe you can move to the full screen, then you'll see the animation.
How do I move to the full screen from here? I wish I can stop all these advertisement from coming. Yeah, I think this is the full screen. Am I in the full screen now?
No, could you go to the slideshow at the top tab?
Slideshow.
There's Home,
Okay.
Insert Design, Slideshow.
Right. I think I may need to go back. I may need to go back because this is not where I want to be.
Okay, sir. Yeah, so now you're in full screen.
Right.
Okay, so we can see.
Right.
Perfect.
Well, again, good evening to everybody here. This appears to be a rather cozy gathering, and I like cozy gathering because it's much more personal, even though it's online. I've been asked to speak about legal responsibility of autonomous weapons and emerging technologies. This concerns an area of law which I hope you all are familiar with, but if you're not, let me tell you something about it. This concerns international humanitarian law, also known as the law of armed conflict, and previously known as the law of war. The law of war is the origin of public international law, the law that governs relations and dealings between states. So you go back to history, the main concern of states with each other is actually over war, not over peace. It was over war. And the law of war developed as the first manifestation of what we now know as public international law, the law that governs states in this world today. Now, what is international humanitarian law, or IHL? This is the legal framework for all armed conflicts in the world today. Note, I'm not using the word war. I'm using the word armed conflict. Why? Because nowadays, the traditional meaning of war no longer applies. Because war implies a war between states, which was declared. If you do not have a declared war, then it's not a war. But nowadays, as you can see from current affairs, there are many, many conflicts in the world today which are armed conflicts, which do not qualify under the traditional definition of war. And so now, international humanitarian law is more often referred to as the law of armed conflict and not so much as international humanitarian law. IHL provides the legal framework for armed conflict, but we must underscore that IHL governs the conduct of hostilities. In other words, how wars or armed conflict takes place. In Latin, this is called jus in bello. IHL is not concerned with whether or not an armed conflict or a war is legal or illegal. IHL does not concern with that. That is known as jus ad bellum. So whenever we talk about IHL, even though it's part of public international law, we are talking about what happens during a war or armed conflict, and not the reasons and legality of a war or an armed conflict. That is governed by other rules of public international law. Now, IHL has got a number of key principles, and the reasons for this go back to its origins. Even though IHL is law, it was law which was not initially developed by lawyers. It was developed by the people who were involved in war, namely the warriors. The warriors developed the rules of IHL mainly with the intention of ensuring that they themselves do not suffer unnecessarily when carrying out their duties as warriors. They may be prepared to die for their cause, for their king, or whatever they're fighting for. But they want to make sure that if they don't die, then they do not suffer unnecessarily as a result of what they are or they're required to do, i.e. to fight for the cause. And the basis of international law is always reciprocity. So by formulating these rules, they expect the other party to also apply the same rules. So this is the origin of IHL. It was developed by soldiers, not by lawyers. It's only lately, mainly during the late 19th and 20th centuries, that lawyers got involved. Now, IHL also has got notions which can go back to a very long way. If you go back to Hindu culture, for example, Hinduism, the Vedic text, so you can find some of the basic principles of IHL there. IHL is also found in principles in China, for example, in the teachings of the great military strategist named Sun Tzu. It's found in Islamic law. It's found in almost every country and every culture because in history, almost every culture and every country engages in wars at some point in time. And all these rules are formulated by the people involved in those wars to ensure that they themselves do not suffer unnecessarily as a result of the fighting. So Aisha has got very ancient origins, but it's been modernized lately through the efforts of largely lawyers and, sadly, politicians. Now, a lot of our Aisha today actually are derived from medieval Europe, in particular the principles of chivalry, which applied to the knights of medieval Europe. The knights, as you probably know, of Europe evolved to be the officers of the armies of today. So the officers originally were the knights of medieval Europe, and they still retain much of the principles of chivalry that govern the conduct of knights in those days. So IHL retains a lot of all those principles that apply to knights fighting in medieval Europe, and they apply in order to ensure that there's no unnecessary suffering when they are involved in wars. Now, what are the key principles of IHL? These have been distilled in the modern times to basically fall within four categories. Firstly, there's a principle of humanity. Now, this has been interpreted to mean that there should not be any unnecessary harm, injury, or destruction during an armed conflict. Importantly, now there's a principle of distinction, which means that when you use force in an armed conflict, you cannot use the force indiscriminately, and force can only be used against another combatant. Force cannot be used against non-combatants. So in IHL, it's important to distinguish who are the persons who are the subject matter of a rule of IHL at any one time. And these are very few. The classes are combatants, non-combatants, and neutrals. Civilians fall within non-combatants. So there are different rules that apply to each of these categories. One of the most important principles of IHL today, and now it's talked about widely, is the principle of proportionality. In other words, force which is used in an armed conflict must be proportionate. And how is it to be determined? How is proportionality to be determined? The basic principle is very simple. The force which is used, in other words, the level of violence used in an armed conflict at any one time must not be excessive in relation to the military objective that's sought to be achieved. You should not use more force than is necessary in order to achieve the immediate military objective. And finally, we have the principle of military necessity, which often is used as a defense, but in fact, it is not meant to be a defense. The basic principle here is that force can only be used where there is a legitimate military objective. Targeting non-combatants is not a legitimate military objective. But having said that, military necessity has often been used as a defense against breaches of IHL. For example, a breach of the principle of distinction. That is not the intention, but in practice, it has been used that way. Now, Historically, the rules of IHL governs human actions and decisions. It governs the person. That's why for breach of IHL, the sanction is applied not against the army, not against the state, but against a person responsible for breaching that rule of IHL. So in this respect, IHL can be considered as part of international criminal law, but it applies in a very special way. It applies to sanction and criminalize decisions taken by humans at a particular point in time. So, for example, if a commander orders a bombing of a civilian target, then IHL will determine the legality of the decision and its consequences at the time when the decision was made and carried out, not on the basis of what happened before or what happened after. The criminal liability attaches at that time. In this respect, I ask you all to recall, since all of you have understandings of the law, the basic principles of criminal law. In other words, there must be mens rea as well as actus rea, and without which no offense has been committed. The same applies in IHL. There must be a mens rea and an actus rea in order for there to be a breach of international humanitarian law. And traditionally, this can only be applied against human beings, not against anybody else. Certainly not against a machine as such. Now, we come to the topic of today, Autonomous Weapon Systems, or AWS. What is an AWS? An AWS is a weapon system which, once activated, can select and engage a target without further human intervention. That's a very simple definition of what is an AWS. Now, seen in this way, any weapon, in fact, many weapons can qualify as autonomous weapon system. And the best example is a bullet. Once a bullet is fired from a rifle or a pistol, the human being that fired lost control over it. It finds its own way to the target. Of course, in the case of a bullet, the target is determined by the human being at that time. But in the sense that it finds its own way there and causes the damage, we can say that it is, in a sense, an autonomous weapon. But, today the situation is very different. Many autonomous weapon systems are not just a simple bullet that's discharged on account of the squeeze of a trigger. They're massive weapon systems, very complex weapon systems, and many of them are powered by artificial intelligence. In other words, they're able to seek out targets on their own and engage those targets without human intervention. And this now has been expanded very widely to include, for example, autonomous aircraft without pilots, which once launched can then identify targets and attack those targets and destroy those targets without any further human intervention. Drones are in the same category. In fact, if you recall what is happening right now in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, much of the fighting is being done by drones, not just drones, but autonomous drones. In other words, they're not drones which are launched with a specific target in mind, but they're drones which are launched which are able to determine for themselves, without human intervention, what are the targets they should engage, and then proceed to engage that target. Now, there are also missiles, autonomous missiles. Well, of course, if we regard a missile as a bullet as an autonomous weapon, missiles are also autonomous weapons because once they are launched, then they find their own way to the target. But what you're talking now are missiles that can identify the target. In the case of a bullet or traditional missiles, the target is identified and then it is launched. But now we have missiles that once launched can identify their own targets without a human being tell them what the target is. In other words, to be pre-programmed in such a way that they can think for themselves and identify what are the targets that they should attack. And included here will be vessels. vessels, ships, small ships, many of them, patrol boats, even submarines, which are equipped with artificial intelligence and which can identify and engage targets and destroy those targets without being directed to do so at a particular point in time. So these have become more and more pervasive, and they will continue to be more and more pervasive. Now, I mentioned that IHL applies to human beings. It sanctions the conduct of human beings. So how does IHL then apply in an environment where much of the fighting is going to be done by autonomous weapon systems? Well, and these systems are not just autonomous, but they are also dependent on artificial intelligence and could undertake missions and attack targets with minimal or sometimes totally without any human intervention at that point in time. So we need to talk about what is the nature of human decision-making where AWSs, autonomous weapon systems, are used. These have been analyzed, and the common categories or characteristics of human involvement in the use of autonomous weapon systems have been defined as follows. Firstly, a system where you have a human in the loop. In other words, a human must approve each engagement before the attack is launched and the target destroyed. An example would be a piloted drone, but it is piloted remotely. In other words, you have a human somewhere way behind the front lines, but he's directing the drone in order to attack a target. He's got a control, he's able to control the drone and use the drone to attack a target. This is similar to the bullet being fired from a gun. There's some control there. Although the drone finds its way to the target, the actual target is attacked only when the order is given to attack. So that is a system where you have an AWS with a human in the loop. Then you have a system with a human on the loop. Now, this is a system that can engage a target autonomously. In other words, it can identify and attack a target on its own without being ordered to do so. Once it's launched, it looks around for the target, identifies the target. Once it's identified, it attacks the target. So there's no human intervention to give a direct order, now shoot or now bomb. Right? But the human is on the loop. Why? Because the human retains the right to intervene to stop or modify the attack. That's called autonomous weapon system with humans on the loop. Now, certain missile systems are like this. And normally it is a system where even though it's launched and the missile can find the target, the human is able to, for example, intervene by destroying the missile before it reaches the target or modifying the missile's path so that it attacks a different target. In other words, even though the weapon is autonomous, there's some form of ultimate control by the human being somewhere, even though the selection of target is done entirely by the artificial intelligence of that missile. But the one that's most controversial are autonomous weapon systems with humans out of the loop. This is where the system identifies, selects, and engages targets fully autonomously based on its programming. Once you launch it, you leave it on its own, it goes on its own, it identifies who it wants to attack, it proceeds to carry out the attack, and then it takes whatever action after that which it's been programmed to do. No human being is involved at all. This is the most challenging of all the autonomous weapon systems. Now, there have been many criticisms of autonomous weapon systems and many concerns expressed. One of the major concerns expressed at the general level is that where you have an autonomous weapon system powered by AI, this can reduce the threshold for the use of force in any armed conflict. Whereas previously you need a human being to decide whether or not to launch an attack against a particular target. For example, an ambulance which you do not know whether a vehicle is an ambulance or it is a target, the human being can then take a decision not to launch the attack until it's verified. But an autonomous weapon system may not be capable of making the decision. It sees a truck, a lorry in enemy territory, immediately informs itself that that is a military equipment of the enemy, and it proceeds to attack. Even though in other circumstances, if a human has been involved, the attack would at least be restrained until the actual facts are verified. So it can reduce the threshold for the use of force. Now, one reason for this is because when you use autonomous weapon systems, you're not using your own soldiers, you're not using your own personnel. You're not putting your personnel in danger. You're putting the machine in danger, but you're not putting your own personnel in danger. So because your own personnel are not endangered, you are more tempted to use a machine to conduct operations which you otherwise may not wish to conduct for fear of casualties on your part, that you may incur casualties. Now, the possibility of casualties is actually a very big consideration in the decision of whether or not to launch a military operation. But if there's no casualties that can be sustained, then even though the attack may not be necessary, because you're using a machine and not a human being, there's always a temptation to go ahead with the attack. Even though if the human being is involved, you may not want to launch the attack. Now, all this reduction in the threshold of violence or the use of violence can have very severe implications worldwide because it has a potential to destabilize global security. In other words, in situations where really there's no reason to resort to force, somebody may decide, because he's using an autonomous weapon system, to use force. Now, once force is used, we can expect that there'll be a retaliation on the other side, and the security situation will deteriorate very quickly to what is actually a war. So the other major issue with AWS is accountability. In other words, who is responsible if something goes wrong, if rules of IHL are breached by the conduct of that autonomous weapon system. Here, the question is very simple. We know that IHL applies to human beings, but human beings can comply with IHL. We have a mind. We can decide whether a particular military situation requires us to undertake certain actions. Can a machine do that? And all autonomous weapon systems are machines. They are programmed machines, programmed in order to engage targets and destroy the target. Now, this question has been distilled in a much sharper way. To read, like, for example, can an autonomous weapon system, which is powered with AI, understand the complex context-dependent principles of distinction and proportionality, which is fundamental to IHL? Can a machine, for example, make a judgment as to whether or not the force that it was programmed to deliver was actually proportionate given the situation on the ground, especially when situations change all the time? Situations are always changing. Just to give an example, there may be a tank in a certain place, and an autonomous weapon system is launched against that tank. But by the time the system reaches that location, the tank may have gone, and instead you have a class of school children walking around that area. Can the weapon system be sufficiently programmed in order to recognize it and not launch the attack when it's been programmed to launch the attack? Then further questions. Can an autonomous weapon system assess what is a military advantage or what is an excessive use of force in a particular situation? Of course, one can say with large language models, it's possible. It's possible. But all these have limitations, especially when the situation changes all the time. And in armed conflict, because it involves movements of human beings, the situation changes all the time. So if an autonomous weapon system breaches the rules of IHL, for example, it launches an attack against non-combatants when it's not supposed to do so, who is responsible? Against whom should the sanctions of IHL be applied? The programmer who programmed the system? The commander who ordered the attack or launched the system? Or the manufacturer of the system? Now, this can be more complex than it appears because all these people could be in different countries, some of which are not involved at all in that particular war or armed conflict. For example, you can have a conflict between, well, let's talk about a recent conflict between India and Pakistan, and the use of autonomous weapon system, and there could be, they use some program which was, for example, formulated in Singapore. Now, Singapore is not a party to the conflict. Should the person in Singapore be responsible if that particular autonomous weapon system fails to comply with the rules of IHL, even though Singapore is not a party to the conflict? So these are all the issues which have not quite been resolved, but they're issues which need to be discussed and understood. Now, what about enforcement? IHL is law, it's international criminal law. And enforcement, of course, is the heart of criminal law. There's no criminal law if there's no enforcement. At the present moment, there are no international treaties that prohibit autonomous weapon system, none at present. No? But the need for regulation of autonomous weapon systems is keenly felt. So right now, there are very intense discussions underway to address lethal autonomous weapon system. In other words, weapon system that can kill. And these discussions are being conducted under the framework of the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW. You may wish to Google to find out more about the CCW. The attempts to formulate another protocol of the CCW to address autonomous weapon system. There are already many protocols to the CCW. The most probably the one which many of you will be most familiar with would be landmines. Landmines actually is a protocol to the CCW, apart from being a separate treaty in itself. So now there are discussions among the states of the world as to whether or not there can be another protocol to regulate the use of autonomous weapon system. And here, the divisions of views between the states of the world have started to emerge. Now, some states and non-governmental organizations are advocating for a preemptive ban. In other words, autonomous weapon systems should be completely prohibited. I don't share that because I do not think it's possible to ban something which is already there. You can regulate it, but you cannot ban it because it's already there. Now, there's another group that calls for not rules, but non-binding guidelines. In other words, these are guidelines that cannot be enforced as a legal rule. To put it another way, they are asking for soft law rather than hard law. And of course, many of the states who are advocating for this are those states which think that they may have reason to use autonomous weapon systems presently or in the future. And very often these are the big states, the big major powers of the world, right? There are also rather idealistic calls that states should not develop lethal autonomous weapons and pledge not to do so. Again, this is a very idealistic position, but these are some of the positions taken by various parties in the discussions under the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. Now, in respect of IHL, the biggest voice is that of the International Committee of the Red Cross, because the International Committee of the Red Cross are the guardians of international humanitarian law. And their main mission is to promote respect for international humanitarian law and ensure to the extent they can that it is complied with. What is the Red Cross position? The Red Cross position is actually quite practical. Firstly, it calls for prohibition on all autonomous weapon systems which are unpredictable and which target specific persons. So you cannot, for example, in the eyes of Red Cross, design an autonomous weapon system to say target the president of a country wherever he may be. That's totally unacceptable. You can target a target, but it must be predictable. In other words, you cannot launch a weapon system that's autonomous, not knowing what or how it's going to carry out its mission. It can be totally out of human control. And secondly, for all others, the Red Cross advocates that there must be rules to ensure that there are meaningful human control and accountability in the use of autonomous weapon systems. In other words, they are saying that for all autonomous weapon systems that are permitted, there must be humans in the loop or on the loop. You cannot have a system where there are no humans, where all humans are out of the loop. Now, again, these are principles which are being advocated. Right now, there are no rules and discussions underway. We hope that in the not too distant future, we'll see some rules that emerge from this to regulate the use of autonomous weapon system. And my personal preference is that the Red Cross position be accepted by the countries of the world. Now, what are some of the emerging issues? There are many emerging issues in IHL today, and some of these are completely intractable. The biggest issue in IHL today is that nowadays wars are conflicts between states, and armed conflicts, which may or may not be conflicts between states, are no longer between states, but they involve non-state actors, armed groups. And these armed groups which are involved have varying degrees of command and control. One of the principles of IHL is command responsibility. In other words, you hold the commander responsible if the persons under his command breach the rules of IHL. Now, that implies that there is a structure in the force that is engaged in the armed conflict, that there is a command structure which passes responsibility all the way down, but at the same time all the way up. So it can hold someone responsible if there's been a breach of the law. For many of the armed groups today, some have this structure, but many are very informal. In the old days, states used to call these informal armed groups as bandits. Some may be bandits in the sense that they actually engage in armed conflict for monetary gain. Some may be fighting for a cause, but the usual term to term all these informally organized armed group are bandits or terrorists. But now, there are many, many such groups with varying degrees of command and control, which means that there are varying degrees of ensuring compliance with IHL. Those who are well organized can have a commander and commanders at every level to ensure that those below them comply with IHL. But when those groups are poorly organized and do not have a command structure, who do you place the responsibility for ensuring that the people who lead comply with IHL? Now, that's the biggest problem in the world today, the proliferation of conflicts involving armed groups, which are non-state actors, but which have varying degrees of command and control. This, among other things, has led to a blurring of distinction between war and peace, and combatants and non-combatants, and also the distinction of conflicts taking place within national boundaries, where you can identify which state is a party to a war or armed conflict and which states which are not. Much of this is on account of the fact that armed conflicts today now involve many armed groups which are not states. Now, what are these conflicts that actually blur the distinction between war and peace and combatants and non-combatants and national boundaries? At the top of my list will be cyber warfare. Cyber warfare will be an increasingly important component of conflict as we go into the future. Cyber warfare can take place anytime, even when there's no conflict. There can be cyber warfare launched by one group or one state against another state. And I think the most telling example of cyber warfare, probably an amusing example, is the war between China and the United States after the Americans bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the time of the Serbian War, the war in the Balkans. The Americans claimed that they made a mistake. The Chinese did not believe them. And what happened after that was that Chinese, I suppose they're mainly students, launched a whole series of cyber attacks on the infrastructure of America. And then the American students and other people launched a cyber attack in retaliation against China. And one attack was followed by another cyber attack. And both parties end up being very bruised until the government called it a day and said, no more, no. Everybody stopped. But that was an example of what was, in fact, the world's first cyber war, which took place between countries which are not at war with each other. So cyber warfare is going to be an increasingly important feature of international relations and the application of international humanitarian law. Another area where there are emerging technologies and emerging challenges is the environment. There are now weapons that can target the environment by causing tidal waves, by causing earthquakes, by causing droughts, by causing floods. How do you then regulate weapons like this? There are already regulations in place, but how do you enforce those regulations, especially where you don't really know who is actually the ones who are undertaking all these operations using all these environmental weapons? Then there's the biological weapons. Now, we've seen how the world was devastated by, in the past, SARS and then recently COVID. Biological weapons is a traditional form of warfare. In the old days, the weapon used was plague. The Mongols used to catapult bodies of people who suffered from plague into cities which they were besieging and spread plague within those cities. So biological warfare is a very old form of warfare. But nowadays, we have much nastier means of conducting biological warfare, which can wipe out a whole population. But the central element in any country that wishes to indulge in biological warfare is that they must not launch a biological attack unless they have first developed a vaccine to protect their own people. Because if biological warfare is launched, the pathogen they release will attack everybody, including your own people. So you must not launch biological warfare until you have a vaccine that can protect your own people. But this is an area which is of great concern because of the developments that are taking place in biological warfare. There is regulation in the form of the Biological Warfare Convention. Question is whether or not those regulations are relevant and effective in today's world. Now, the nastiest weapons which are being developed now, and there's evidence that these have been developed, are genetic weapons. These are weapons which are targeted to attack people on account of the characteristics of their genes. Who are those people who can be attacked? Well, they're people with unique genes. For example, Chinese, Slavs. I mean, I'm of Chinese descent. I'm not Chinese, but I'm of Chinese descent. I have Chinese genes. My many South Indian friends, South Asian friends, for example, they have the genes of South Asians. Many of my friends are Tamils. They have the genes of Tamils. Now, if somebody can develop a biological weapon that attacks people with these genes, it can be devastating, can wipe out the entire race. Now, we know that's happening now, although it's not been made very patent. Question is, how do we regulate it to ensure that it doesn't cause too much suffering as we go into the world of tomorrow? And what we've seen recently, that even everyday objects have been used as weapons. The best example, the use of exploding pages, where the Israelis put in explosives in handheld pages and then got them distributed to the members of Hezbollah and their families in Lebanon, and at a given time exploded all these pages, causing tremendous casualties. In fact, they wiped out Hezbollah. Now, these are everyday objects which everybody does not assume would pose any danger, and yet they can be weaponized. Now, the sort of thinking that will lead to the use of weapons like this, I leave you all to decide how valid thinking to use a weapon like this would be. But it can cause tremendous suffering, and it did, because most of the time, what it caused was blindness. The pager ring, somebody pick it up to look at the message, and then it explodes. So there's been a lot of blindness, a lot of people's eyesight have been destroyed. Not just members of Hezbollah. There are reports of children, for example, picking up the pages to take a look, and then it explodes and blinds them, not to mention causing severe injuries to their face. So these are the sort of tactics which we are seeing coming up in today's world. What we can conclude is that the principles of IHL, which was based on chivalrous conduct of medieval European knights and similar groups, similar armed groups in other parts of the world, for example, the Japanese samurai, have been completely thrown aside on account of political necessity to achieve a quick victory. And of course, we cannot denigrate or diminish the element of racism in some of these, in the development of some of these weapons. So, what do we see going to the future? Because of AWS, autonomous weapon systems, and emerging what we call means and methods of warfare or of armed conflict, we are going to see declining involvement of human decision-making in armed conflicts. Now, we're going to see greater use of artificial intelligence in planning and targeting. And one example will be the recent India-Pakistan air battle, where both air forces remain within their respective national borders. They never cross the line between India and Pakistan, and yet were able to engage each other using autonomous missiles, which have a range of up to 150 kilometers, far away, beyond visual control. Everything was done by artificial intelligence. The artificial intelligence identifies the targets, creates the decoys, and then engages the targets. This is one of the clearest examples of an actual military fight where artificial intelligence played a very important role. And this will not be the end. There will be more and greater use of autonomous weapon system. And one example which particularly struck me was the Chinese robotic war dog. China has a population problem. It's got a declining population. So it's going to robotics and automation in a very big way. And last year, they displayed their robotic war dog. It's a robot. It can be autonomous. It carries weapons. It's run on batteries, which can be resupplied by drones. It can go anywhere, and it can hide, remain silent for a long time before being activated and launching attacks. And it can be completely autonomous. Now, this is going to change the future of warfare, because we can imagine the Chinese said that they've got about 10,000 of these robotic war dogs. I don't believe that. Given the industrial capacity of China, I won't be surprised if they can easily roll out 1 million of this. So what does it mean? It means that in future, wars are no longer going to be fought between human beings. More and more wars and armed conflicts are going to take place between machines, not just machines, but machines which are autonomous, powered by artificial intelligence, where they could engage targets and use violence and cause disruption without human intervention. I have half-jokingly said that in future, we do not need soldiers anymore. We do not need soldiers because all the fighting will be done by machines who will decide where to fight, when to fight, and how to fight. So where does that leave IHL, which is actually targeted at the actions of human beings? Now, there's a question that, as of this time, has got no answer. But given human ingenuity and human need. We will develop the answers, except we do not know what the answers are going to be. So my parting remark here will be a very simple one. Watch this space, because there are numerous challenges to IHL and its fundamental principles at this present time. But we, being humans, I'm confident, can address these challenges, overcome them, and in a small way, ensure a better world for those that come after us. So thank you all very much. That's my presentation. And I'll be more than happy to engage in the discussion with all of you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a very insightful session, and I think you have answered most of the questions. Let me start by taking this one. I think it's quite long. Why have multilateral talks been slow, and what might break this impasse? The CCW group of governmental experts has met for years, but must reach consensus, and some observers note stalling tactics by a few states. Given this, the latest UN resolution mandates open from the UN General Assembly consultations, including human rights and ethics perspectives in 2025. How might these broader talks involving all UN members, NGOs, and experts help build momentum for concrete rules? This was asked by Anai Satiwari in the chat box.
Sorry, could you repeat the question again? I seem to have missed parts of the question.
Okay, so why have multilateral talks been slow and what might break this impasse? And the CCW group of governmental experts has met for years but must reach consensus, and some observers are noting some stalling tactics by a few states. And given the latest UN resolution mandates open for the UN General Assembly consultations, which includes human rights, ethics, and perspectives in 2025. So how might these broader talks involving all UN members and NGOs and experts help build momentum for concrete rules?
Well, talks on arms control, and this is part of the system of arms control, have always been difficult. Have always been difficult, and most of the obstacles are raised by those countries that do not wish to have arms control, because these are the countries who are most advanced in terms of military technology and military tactics. That's always the case. So they'll do whatever they can in order to obstruct the development of rules that might constrain them in their ability to use their weapons whenever and wherever they like. Now, how is this going to change? This will change only where, not on account of the world coming together, where those countries themselves feel, for domestic reasons, that they have to move ahead with the rules. Otherwise, they will find a domestic reaction against their positions. That is very difficult to achieve in countries which have a tradition uh, of being preeminent over others. Very, very difficult, because the population is used to a position where they are always the preeminent state over other states. So that's very hard to come about. What we can possibly see is that we have a case of X minus Y situation. In other words, where most countries of the world will agree on certain rules, but certain countries, normally the countries that can refuse to agree, will be out of it. Now, the clearest example would be the Law of the Sea Convention. I think many of you may be aware of that. The Law of the Sea Convention was negotiated over many, many years. And now we have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which basically sets out the rules on maritime boundaries, passage of ships. The country which was probably most involved in the negotiations, which was chaired by Singapore, Singapore chaired the discussions. The country that was probably most involved was the United States. And many of the rules that were eventually adopted reflected the position of the United States. So what happened was, after the convention was adopted, the United States refused to ratify the treaty. So in other words, the rest of the world is bound to the rules which the United States would like to see, but the United States itself is not. Now, we can expect that. But within the rest of the world, they consider themselves to be bound. We have established a certain order, which is good for the world as a whole. And because the rest of the world has established that order, even though the United States is not a party to the convention, it cannot unilaterally act against the basis of that order. It may pick and choose what rules it wants to comply with, can say certain rules do not apply to it, but it cannot go so far to say these rules don't exist because so many of the rest of the world have actually agreed on these rules. So what we have a situation is that applying to the CCW, we can have a situation where many countries agree that certain types of weapon are inappropriate and should not be allowed. But even for countries that don't agree, right, there is an imperative to at least not go too far in the use of those kinds of weapons. Now, in the context of CCW, the weapon that comes to mind here is one which I mentioned earlier, which is landmines. The United States has not agreed to the prohibition of landmines. So they are not prohibited from producing landmines, even though the rest of the world, most of the countries of the world are prohibited by treaty from producing landmines. But even though they are not prohibited, have you heard of the United States using landmines recently? I'm not. In other words, they recognize that in order to be considered as a responsible member of the international community, they cannot go too far away from the rules that the rest of the world has agreed. So I think this may be the way forward. We must accept that big countries will not want constraints on what they can do militarily. But if everybody else in the world, or at least a vast majority of the world, agrees that this kind of regulation is necessary, that acts as some form of constraint against these big countries, these big military powers, from going and acting too far away from the rules.
Thank you, sir. We're almost out of time, but I think let's do two more round of questions, if that's okay with you. So the next question is machine learning is emerging as a disruptive technology for next generation autonomous weapons. How can regulators and militaries keep pace with machine learning's rapid update cycles, where software changes can fundamentally alter system behavior after certification?
Well, I do not think you can regulate machine learning. Machine learning is there. Every time you correct the outcome of an AI issue, a question put to AI, once you get the answer, you correct it, the AI will learn and keeps on improving. Now, there are two dangers here. One is the creation of data in order to get the AI to give you the outcome that you want. And that is really happening. People are creating data with the specific intention of, in a way, to use it colloquially, fooling the AI. So the AI will give you the answer that you actually want. So that's one thing. The other thing is machine learning is going to be there all the time, and it's developing so fast that you cannot regulate it. It's just not possible to regulate machine learning because the amount of information data generated by the world as a whole is absolutely vast. So that's just not possible. But what we can do is to put in the principles which restrain the use of AI so that it does not cause unnecessary suffering. And that is what's being done. The suggestions made, for example, by the Red Cross, that lethal and autonomous weapons that target specific persons should be banned. And that is a principle. That's a principle. So even if they learn something as to how to target better, it doesn't matter because they're banned. Likewise, the very logical Red Cross principle that yes, you can have autonomous weapons, but you must have humans at least on the loop. That is another good principle. So AI can be regulated, or the use of AI in weapons can be regulated not by trying to regulate the content of the thinking of the AI, but rather by putting in place principles on the use of the AI.
Thank you, sir. Let's do this last round of questions. So, Research Institute from Sri Lanka has three questions. They're asking how should we define agency in a world where inanimate objects influence security outcomes? Second, what strategies can militaries adopt to counter the agency of inanimate objects like IEDs or drones? And lastly, how do we balance technological advancements in warfare with the ethical implications of autonomous systems? Let's do this as the last round of questions.
Yeah, I think those questions are very difficult to answer and they cannot be answered. Um, Advancements are going to happen. You cannot stop it. Advancements are going to happen. And well, you say you wish to regulate inanimate objects. Well, there are many efforts already in place to regulate inanimate objects. Mines being just one example. So there are some things that can be done, but there are some things that cannot be done. I like to repeat what I said earlier. The regulation should be on the basis of principle, not on the basis of actual actions, because it's just not possible. You got to regulate in terms of principle. You cannot say an AI cannot learn or in any object cannot be used, but you can regulate how it can be used. And I think in terms of agency, well, we have got to go back, and this is where a lot of work is still needs to be done to identify who are the persons we like to make responsible when all these weapons and weapon systems cause damage, which breaches the basic principles of IHL. We need to work out the rules as to who we should hold responsible. And once we identify who is responsible, then we've got to leave it to them to make sure that they don't take action that result in them being found liable for any particular result which was on account of a breach of IHL.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this insightful session and your time. And I would also like to thank all the audience for joining us today. And, yes, that's it from my side. If you have any parting words, now would be the time. Otherwise, we will end the session for now.
Well, my parting words would be to thank you and your colleagues, Vivek and IC itself for this opportunity to interact with everybody present here today, even though the interaction is online. But I think from the questions which have been posed, it does show that this is a topic that all of us have a common interest in.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. So have a good evening.
Well, thank you all very much.